Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Uh, we're starting with our YSI Young Scholars Initiative session at this AHE virtual conference. My name is Nicolas. On behalf of the YSI organization team, I want to welcome you all. This seminar has been organized by the collaboration of two working groups of YSI, the History of Economic Thought Group and the Economic Development Group. YSI is a worldwide platform that tries to gather young scholars from all over the world, and every one of you who considers himself or herself as a young scholar is welcome to join one of the few working groups that are still working and connecting people from all over the world. And we're organizing, our original plan was to have a workshop within the AHE conference on site. Instead, we're organizing this session. We'll be organizing a plenary session on July 31st, and we're organizing a few webinars within this same track that are taking place. The first one took place last Wednesday, and the next one will take place on July 29th. So if anyone's interested in joining this webinar, please let me know and I'll send you the link. We're still waiting for our third participant who hasn't joined yet, but we'll see if she joins later on. The whole idea of this workshop was to discuss pluralism in economics from heterodox and global south perspectives. The idea was to take into consideration the fact that economic theory can also be analyzed from a decolonial point of view, or from the way colonialism has impact on the way we teach, we learn, we study economics. And our goal was to put that into question. So we chose these papers that dealt with pluralism and decolonialism from students and for young scholars who live in the global south or based in the global south, or who deal with these economic issues from decolonial perspectives. And that's why we chose today Kinsey Hanley, Leandro Bona, and Andrea who are here with us right now. So we'll start with Barkin's presentation, the presentations first, and have the questions at the end. As long as all the papers have deal with similar perspectives, we thought it would be better to have the questions at the end so that there could be some dialogue between them as well. So feel free to send your questions on the chat box, and if there's any question that should be answered during the presentation because something's not understood, then I'll read it and I'll ask the presenters to clarify that. So Barkin, the audience is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Nicolas. Can everyone hear me? I hope everyone can hear me. Okay, perfect. This was originally a project of mine for Rendell Ray for a class about Minsky's economic theories, and the overarching topic of the paper was the financial instability hypothesis. And one thing to keep in mind is the financial instability hypothesis was not explicitly put together by Minsky up until his later writings. So one of my goal was to go back to his archives, his writings, and put together a more complete version of the financial instability hypothesis, so that you could consider as my interpretation of the financial instability hypothesis. Oops. So the outline of the presentation, I'm just going to give you the outline of the instability hypothesis, and then I'm going to break it down. So the first part will be the evolution of the capitalist system. And, for those of you who know Minsky's writing, he referred to capitalism is not a monolith. There are 57 varieties, like the Heinz ketchup. And then I'm going to go to the investment theory, and then I'm going to talk about employment or unemployment in capitalist system. Then Minsky's proposals for the restructuring and reformation of the institutions. And then I'm going to give out my conclusions. And, I'm going to come back to this, but my argument is that, financial instability hypothesis is a holistic approach because it includes not only the evolution of the institutions of finance, investment, and employment theory, but also, proposals and reforms to eliminate unemployment and innate instability problem of a capitalist system. So the outline. So I just want to point out in the outline, who were influential people in Minsky's life, and where did this instability hypothesis come about. So as for those of you who know Minsky, he was Schumpeter's student, and Schumpeter had business cycle theories and Kitchen, Juglar, and Kondratiev, but Minsky was specifically influenced by the Juglar cycles because Juglar cycles included innovation in the financial structure of an economy. So he emphasized the Juglar cycles because he believes that capitalism is a financial system. So if you want to understand capitalism, you need to understand the finance. And then, he was influenced by Keynesian investment theory, which includes non-neutrality of money and, money as the determinant of current output and capital asset prices. And I'm going to come back to this later. And, income and payment flows as the determinant of investment behavior, which, Keynes referred to as animal spirits. And, he was also influenced by Fisher's debt deflation theory, and in which over-indebtedness leads to changes in institutional structure of financial commitments and instruments, which in turn lead to debt deflation for Minsky. And this is actually what happened in 2008. And then lastly, he was influenced by the Schumpeterian notion of the banks, right? So banks as intermediaries for the medium of payments and for the capital development of economy. So the first part, the evolution of the capitalist system. As I said, Minsky believed that capitalism is a financial system, which is dependent upon innovation and changes in the institutional structure of the financial system. So because Minsky believed, that capitalism is a financial system and we need to understand finance, we need to look at the way the system was evolved in the United States. So he, when I mentioned the 57 varieties of capitalism, and capitalism is not a monolith, that was what I was referring as, him breaking down into chronological order of capitalist systems in the US. So the first one was the commercial capitalism, in which, this was in the 18th century, households owned small stocks of capital assets, and there was a separation of finance and production process, and the financial institutions and banking was for commerce and related activities. Then comes the 19th century with the finance capitalism, and in that you have the development of canals and railways and utilities together with the manufacturing sector. There was the importation of capital goods and external finance for projects. You have the development of financial houses and creditors to Europe, and then comes the Great Depression of 1929, and that marks the end of the finance capitalism. After the end of the Great Depression, you have the Glass-Steagall Act, which separates the activities of commercial and financial investment banks. And because of this, then you start having the household possession of government debt through savings. And so after this regulation, you have literally firms being free of stockholder control. And the control of the firms goes to households because of the savings, the households were given ownership in the corporation. So Minsky calls this people's capitalism. Then, fast forward to 70s and 80s, you have the rise of the money manager capitalism, in which there was the emergence of pension funds, mutual funds, and the insurance companies. So for Minsky, this included new layers of financial intermediaries. So these intermediaries were initially conservative in their investments, but because of the stagflation of the 70s and 80s, this changed their business model to short-term returns, which included income plus net asset value change in the short run. So this was a justification for them to invest on less than investment grade securities. And Minsky also uses another term for this called casino capitalism because it was just very risky and it was in a way gambling. It included leverage buyouts and high yield junk bonds to increase the supply and demand for the equity base. There was a threat from the electronic funds and credit cards, and this included the problem of the vendor's discount because the checks were too costly and the banks couldn't cover the cost of the checks. The credit cards and electronic funds were being a problem. again, the same period, there was innovation of derivatives and securitization. So this, in the long run, by the 90s and early 2000, it leads to systemic indebtedness. And, you know, even before that, you see like some failure of the system and the instability caused by the Volcker shock. When the interest rates were like pushed down, they caused the crash of the asset values and the cash flow patterns. And, you know, there isn't like, I haven't seen any literature on this, but you know, then what happens to the money manager capitalism? Are we still in that phase? Are we still in the money manager capitalism phase, or was 2008 global financial crisis end of the money manager capitalism? What about the implications of COVID? Are we going into a new system of capitalism? So these are the questions to elaborate in the future papers, obviously. So going back to the investment theory. So now I'm going to break down the separate parts of the financial instability hypothesis. So again, instability is endogenous for Minsky and innate to the capitalist system. And, you know, he disputes the neoclassical synthesis and says, ceteris paribus, decentralized market system will not attain a self-sustaining, stable price, full employment equilibrium. And, you know, there are two types of price systems in Minsky's mind. One is capital asset prices, and the other one's current output prices, and they are the determinants of investment. So capital assets for Minsky, they leave a residue of debt instruments, and the demand price of the investment depends on the future income cash flow. So you expect a future income to make from that investment. It depends, it determines the demand price. So if the capital assets yield adequate income, then your decision to take that debt and invest is validated. So if not, debt and capital asset price deflation could reduce the investment demand. Minsky assumed workers consume all their wages and capitalists save all their profits. So it's in a way Kaleckian way of thinking. Profits equal investment. The financing determine capital asset prices, effective demand for investment, and the supply price of investment outputs. Investment, in a way, for Minsky, investment is the primary element of the economy. Government budget, consumption behavior, and money wages are supplementary. So profits, capital asset prices, financial market structure, and investment, they all determine financial stability or instability in a way. And then, you know, for the current output prices, the way they are determined is there are two types of business investment for the current output: the internal financing and external financing. And internal financing is like the financing from your own resources, existing resources, and external financing is in a way borrowing. So cash flow commitments, present value calculations, and liquid asset, they all determine the structure of the financial markets and behavioral economic units. So in other parts of the financial instability hypothesis, Minsky criticizes the Patinkin resolution. And what is the Patinkin resolution? For them, exogenous money variable influences consumption out of income, which leads to an increase in the price level deflated value of money balance. So this in turn results in an increase in the demand for consumer goods and thus more employment. So what is the implication of this? The full employment equilibrium is compatible with the market system. And Minsky criticizes this and says, you know, this doesn't acknowledge the influence of bankruptcy on asset prices and financing of investment, so debt deflation part. And Minsky says there is no explanation of the transitionary state beyond full employment. Once the full employment is attained and maintained, there's a speculative boom beyond full employment. And, you know, Patinkin process might lead the economy out of a stagnation, but not to an equilibrium. So market mechanism could bring the economy to full employment, which contains endogenous disequilibrating forces in and of itself. So and beyond full employment, there appears to be more debt financing due to optimism because all the past debts are validated. So this coincides with financialization and financial innovation, Schumpeterian-Juglar cycle. And the results are higher price for assets and higher demand price for current investment due to large availability of external financing. So following that, higher investment and high profits, it creates an investment boom and inflation. And then, you know, you have the cycle again starting. This causes instability in a period of expansion. So Minsky defined this as an underemployment equilibrium, which is a transitory state following a debt deflation and a deep depression. So alternatively, market could react to unemployment by lowering wages and prices, which leads to low profits and cash flows. This doesn't validate the past debts. and depending on other ratios, and then ultimately could pave the way for debt deflation and bankruptcy. So two price systems, as I mentioned. So one of them, the first one, is how the capital asset prices are determined. So the capital asset prices, they yield quasi-rents, which are simply gross profits. And these quasi-rents could be transformed into prices of capital assets, which determine the supply price of investment. And then financial assets, they similarly involve capitalization rate based on the future cash flows and elements of uncertainty, as I mentioned before. So the price of capital and financial assets, they also rely on cash flows and other conditions. The higher the quantity of money, the higher the capital and financing of the prices. This in turn leads to higher price of capital assets due to higher returns and capitalization rate and higher borrowing at favorable rates. An increase in consumption, this leads to an optimism, which causes an increase in consumption and investment, which leads to economy into a speculative boom. Then the current output price determination. So for business financing, there are three sources, right? Cash, financial assets on hand, internal funds, and external funds. Aggregate internal funds are not adequate to finance gross investment because of the outflow of business debts and dividends and interest payments on principal debt and executive labor costs. So they're supplemented with external funds, which are basically like borrowing. So balance sheets, they have a mix of both. The production financing is short-term, while permanent financing includes bonds, mortgages, equity issues, and corporate retained earnings. So the price of the capital assets and market conditions create a demand function for investment. Labor costs and short-term interest rates, they create a supply function of investment, and financing affects the effective demand for investment. The decision to invest obviously relies on uncertainty, as I mentioned, Keynesian and animal spirits. This uncertainty depends on the history of the success of the investment that you made in the past and your own conventions, the animal spirits. And a history of success could reduce the margin of safety because it leads to optimism and you are willing to take more risks, whereas a history of failure could increase your margin of safety. You tend to be more you tend to take less risks. So larger government deficit and current account surplus on the balance of payments are necessary for internal funds to be utilized in investment. And this goes to Lynn Godley's three sectoral balances. If the internal funds are not adequate, then the external funds could be borrowed. And then an increase in borrowers' risks due to increase in external financing reduces demand for capital assets. Lender's risk is a function of interest rates and the covenants and codicils, as I mentioned before. These are dependent on negotiation and uncertainty. Investment will happen until the point of intersection of the borrowers and lender's risk. And elasticity of borrowers and lenders' risk will depend on their expectations and past successes. And the investment is ultimately determined by the cash flows, expected cash flows, because it's a function of quasi-rents. If the cash flows are not enough, then again, external financing is necessary. So I'm repeating these because I'm going to come back to them later, right? So if there are more profits than expected, there is an improvement in the inflow of internal funds that will implicitly increase the price of capital assets and borrowers' willingness to finance externally. Optimism. Short-term interest rates influence the supply price of output. Partially completed investment could create an inelastic demand for financing. And the rising inelastic demand will result in an increase in supply prices unless they're infinitely elastic. The cost of financing increases after the favorable conditions have been maintained over time. The supply finance could become very inelastic due to policies and endogenous other forces in the banking system. This could influence the short-term rates, which ultimately leads to rapid changes in the long-term rates and, does decrease in price of the stocks and bonds. And, ultimately these could have adverse effects on the demand price of capital assets and the supply price of investments. So employment or unemployment in the financial instability hypothesis. So this part was where I went back to the Minskian archives and just try to pull things together and relate them to the investment theory. So Minsky, he believed that the attainment and the maintenance of the tight full employment. So since we talked about there's an endogenous instability to the capitalist system, the question becomes, how do we mitigate this instability? And Minsky believed that if we maintain tight full employment at all times, then we could contain this instability of the capitalist system. Minsky also complained that monetary and fiscal authorities were unjustifiably tolerating persistently high unemployment at the expense of their fight against inflation. So one of the fundamental problem was that the perception about the unemployed as the float and not the market system. So he made some proposals to eliminate unemployment, and this included not changing the behavior of the people as the neoclassical synthesis claims, but the changing of the system. So the ultimate goal should be to attain the type full employment, maintain it, and modify our institutions that target inflation. His definition of the type full employment was when a broad cross-sectional occupations and industries and locations and employers are willing to work at the going wage and salaries. So you would prefer to employ more workers than they are available. So he defined the labor market tightness as the combination of cohesive relative wages and the prominence of trade unions. For him, there were two labor markets. One was the high wage industries, and the other one was the low wage industries. High wage industries were highly selective, skilled, and trained people with infinitely elastic labor supply at the going wage, whereas the low wage industries were characterized by the outward sloping supply curve, and their positions depend on their relation with the high wage industries. The employment in the high wage industries increase. The supply curve of the workers in the low wage industries shifts to the left. When the employment in the high wage industries decreases, the supply curve of the workers in the low wage industries shifts to the right, so the vice versa. So if the demand for high wage workers increase, the supply curve of low wage workers shifts to the left. Thus, wages and employment rise in the low wage industry. The same scenario happens if the aggregate demand increases. So these changes in the low wage industries, they rely on reaction of the labor force participation to higher worker improved job availability. At the end of the day, low wage workers' wages would rise while high wage workers' wage would remain constant. So Minsky said, okay, so we need to maintain type full employment. How do we get there? We know how the framework works, as I explained to you, the supply and demand curve of the high wage and the low wage industries. I had some visuals for them, but I don't think I have time to go into the visuals. But so how do we maintain these curves at an equilibrium, and how do we achieve the type full employment? So intermediate policy objectives. So they aim to constrain the rise of wages in high wage industries while facilitate the rise of wages in the low wage industries. So if we keep the price levels in the high wage industries constant or let them rise at a lower rate than the labor productivity, we could also increase the price levels in the low wage industries at the same or higher rates of labor productivity. So then we could achieve the type full employment. But he warned that there could be some transitional inflation, but once we get to the type full employment and we maintain it, this inflation would be just temporary, it will cease. He appealed at the end of the paper to the American society and to the government that we need to choose between not inflation and unemployment, but inflation and poverty. So for him, inflation also had some psychological components to it. So if you believe in it, it would happen. So he believed that, not all inflations were bad because there was some, as I said, there would be some temporary inflation once we get to the type full employment, but after beyond that, if we maintain it, then it would cease. So if the choice is between inflation and poverty, then how do we mitigate the poverty? Because ultimately, if we mitigate the poverty problem, then again, it all ties back to the instability of the system. So his program against the poverty was extensive and attempted to address the institutional structure of the labor markets and government and educational sector. So initially, he wanted a clear definition of full employment as the type full employment with an inclusion of a relative income policy. He also advocated for the creation of a more homogeneous and fluid labor force to prevent that transitional inflation when the labor aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate supply. He advocated for job training, job relocation, substitution of labor. These are the ways we could make the labor force more homogeneous and fluid. He stressed the significance of necessity to increase spending on education, which is important to break the cycle of poverty. And he tried to design some specific programs for the high school dropouts. He supported the resurrection of the New Deal era programs. but warned that public works program there would be inefficient because they already provide jobs for already well-off workers. Like right now, public works program, they would work, but we also need other types of jobs in the job guarantee scheme. So he advised the establishment of a wage support law with the national minimum wage. So he called for the collaboration of federal, state, and local governments to design and submit projects and employ workers according to their needs. And he, ultimately he said, we need to institute transitionary policies until we get to the long run and intermediate policy objectives for the protection of high wage workers because of their capital losses during the transitional inflationary period, subsidize employment opportunities for poor and ill-trained, improvements in transfer payments like children's allowances, universal Medicare, medical care for everyone without means tests. So my conclusions, again, so financial stability hypothesis, as I mentioned, it included the investment part and some parts of the unemployment or the employment part, right? I brought other parts of the unemployment part and then his program against the poverty. So, there's like you could say a school of branch, that, considers this a holistic way to, look at the capitalist system, because we don't only look at the financial system, but we also look at the unemployment and we look at the poverty. So we look at it in a very holistic way to contain the innate instability of the capitalist system. And because we look at it very holistically, then, we need to find ways to address this holistically. And it requires reformation and the restructuring of our institutions. And as I mentioned, Minsky had a very detailed program about the poverty and how to tackle it, and then thus unemployment and thus financial instability. So this issue is, I think, very significant because, if we don't consider these together, then we really don't understand the capitalist system and how to prevent or mitigate at least the innate instability attached to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barkin. We haven't heard any news from Maisa so far, so I tell Leandro to join. And if you have any questions for Barkin, you can start writing them on the chat, and then we'll have a wide and long time for Q&A for both presentations together at the end.
Okay, so I see two. We hear you, and then if you want to join, okay, so these are you.
Yeah, that was me, yes. Just
okay.
Leandro, the audience is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Leandro Bona, I'm from Argentina. First of all, I would like to thank both the Association for Heterodox Economics and YSI for the organization of this panel, and especially Ian Almeida, Nicolás Boskin, and Sulvi Kizar, that were the organizers in the first time from YSI. So I'm going to show my screen. Okay. My contribution in this case is called Decoloniality and Pluralism for Introductory Economics, an Experience from Argentina. And I think this paper dialogues with the one from Maisa, who's not there, because she talks about post-autistic organization in France, and she discusses pluralism in economic teaching. I think it will also good dialogue with future panels that are going to be in the Association for Heterodox Economics in the next days, merely the one in day 5, teaching heterodox economics, and the one from day 8, anti-colonial and post-colonial development. Also, a precedent panel with Songo, Rama, and Barrancos talk about these things. And well, I hope that this contribution could also contribute again on these subjects. What I would like to highlight in this contribution is that in general, I think we are familiar to discuss against orthodox theories, but even if we sometimes teach alternative approaches, we are less familiar to put on debate methodology, contents, and authors. So this contribution would like to discuss these things. So the objective of this contribution is starting to discuss what's wrong about economic teaching, and then this paper will suggest some tools, methods, techniques, and counteract these problems in consonance with teaching practices at secondary school and university level in public institutions of Argentina. That's where I teach, in the National University of La Plata. So the findings of this investigation would try to answer to some questions such as how to create an introductory course with a pluralistic approach, what kind of bibliography is more useful, which group activities are stimulating, what kind of innovative tasks can be given to students within the classrooms to enhance the learning experience, what is the importance of exposing students to real-life problems and giving them tasks which they have to perform in field, or which complementary resources can generate interest in students. Well, the organization of this contribution has three parts. The first one, which I will be focused on, is the diagnosis of economic teaching, especially in peripheral countries. Then I will propose a three-dimensional approach, and finally the findings linked to 3 steps taken from my experience in Argentina, where we can discuss contents, authors, references, plurality, and things to do outside the classroom. Well, what's wrong about economic teaching? Talking about the diagnosis of economic teaching in general, I think we could agree that the teaching of economics is mostly from a neoclassical perspective. Sihauli have recently talked about Minsky, which is an author for example, we don't study in Argentina, and in general, there is lack of participation of post-Keynesian authors, but not only post-Keynesians. We could mention Marxists, Schumpeterians, regulation theory authors, structuralists, or dependentists. Well, this is reproduced globally in undergraduate and postgraduate levels, as pointed out by numerous institutions such as the Critical Economic Society from Argentina and Uruguay, Rethinking Economics, Reteaching Economics, the the CEPLA, which is an organization from Latin America, etc. Tran and Cohen-Furot showed that this is a problem all over the world, but I think especially in peripheral countries. I am going to say why in a few minutes. So talking about this, what I highlighted in my contribution is that I think we have 3 major problems related to economic teaching. First one, it is restricted to practically one only way of available approaches. Secondly, pedagogy has incorporated few new practices about socioeconomic phenomena. And third, colonial approach to power or knowledge. Okay, 3 problems. I'm going to focus on this. First problem will be what I call the dictatorship of neoclassical thought. Here there is a picture of Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet and Milton Friedman. Well, neoliberalism started in Latin America in 1973 with Pinochet, and then in Argentina in 76. But the thing is that we are learning only neoclassical school of thought in all institutions. And when we do this, if we just focus on one only school of thought, we disregard the possibility of debate between different approaches. And that is what's happening in the economic teaching all over the world. But not only that. The second thing is that mainstream ignores socio-historical analysis. And this was pointed out by Pierre Bourdieu or Karl Polanyi and other authors that show that economics is not, it's a social science, and we should incorporate all these issues in the economic analysis. So the first problem will be monism, which is something that Maisa in her work, in her contribution, points out very well. We have evidence of this. For example, we have an investigation on the UK, which shows that in 172 economic courses in these countries, in the UK, reveal lack of alternatives. And we have the same problem in Argentina. Nicolás, which is running this panel, he also investigated this, and the Critical Economic Society in Argentina and Uruguay showed the same thing for our countries. And this is something that happens all over our countries. But in the recent years, and after the crisis of, in the last 12 years, and continuing right now, there has been strikes and fights against monism in economic teaching. And this panel also wants to contribute fight. The second problem will be methodology, content, and pedagogy. Okay, pedagogy, there are some authors like Becker and Watts or Hoyt and McGoldrick that show that pedagogy in economic teaching has evolved very little in the last 20 or 30 years. Other social sciences have evolved more than economic teaching, but we're still linked to chat and talk methodology. And this generates a lack of motivation for students. So when we do this, this is not a problem just of pedagogy, but also a problem of content. Because subjects like conflict, power, inequality, informality, environment, racism, imperialism, gender, which are highly important in the first 21st century, are usually excluded from economic curricula. And this is particularly important in peripheral societies such as Argentina. Some days ago, I heard Hayati Ghosh, who's an Indian researcher, and she talked about COVID-19, and she showed that 180 people in India, workers, are in trouble because of the COVID. And in Argentina, as Dora Barrancos has just said, we have from 20 million people in the labor market, we have 9 million people that demanded government transfers in the last 3 months. So what I'm going to express here, that in our societies, we have a huge informality, but generally we study agent-based models and labor market models that exclude informality. And in our societies, this would be very important. So first thing is monism, just neoclassical thinking, and then we have the problem of pedagogy, how to teach, and contents, what to teach. And we are losing things we should incorporate for our societies. And the third thing will be the coloniality of knowledge or the coloniality of power. Well, some minutes ago, Rama Saladin has expressed this about post-coloniality. Her presentation a few minutes ago with Barrancos and Dongo showed that decolonial thinking is necessary for the discussion of a lot of things that have been going on in the recent years, and especially in societies from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. What is the problem about coloniality of knowledge? That is linked to coloniality of power. Coloniality of power is a subject developed by Aníbal Quijano, who was a Peruvian researcher, but it's developed now by authors like Ramón Grosfoguel, Castro Gómez, Walsh, Enrique Dussel, and other authors. And the problem is that coloniality of power plays a very important role in the formation of students because it affects contents, questions, and methods. It is supported by a wide dissemination network and academic rules of validation, giving European or US universities preponderance, such as Lander, a Venezuelan author, pointed out some years ago. This is not just a problem about the history of economics. In general, for example, in Latin America, we know very well the history of the Greeks or the French Revolution, but we do not study the Haitian Revolution that happened at the same time as the French Revolution, or we do not study about the Aztecs or the Inca Imperium. So what is the problem here? That we are pursuing an Eurocentric way of teaching and learning. And this is just what these authors pointed out some years ago. So it's not only about contents, but also about who are we reading. We use agent-based models, and they are based on people that are white, male, middle income, heterosexual, and healthy. And we do not get to know authors from Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, or Africa. Dora Barrancos and have talked about this a few minutes ago, but also the other panelists. So, given these problems, I propose a three-dimensional approach in order to tackle these problems. And this three-dimensional approach is based on three things. First of all, monism versus pluralism. Well, as I was saying, the paper from MISA talked about this, so I was not going to talk about this. But the difference between pluralism and monism is very important in economic teaching, because pluralism and plurality offers a vision of social interaction understood as conflict, something that Heraclitus said some centuries ago, and competition between positions which cannot be hierarchized. So pluralism needs an ontology of contents, dependency of fundamental principles based on plural foundations, and epistemology of continuous extension of available methodologies, and a methodology heterogeneous. This is something we always talk about. In economics, there is not just one answer, one right, correct answer, but many different answers. As Hanley said, for example, about Minsky, we can say that he has an interesting theory, and we can use another theories that could be interesting and correct too, in order to tackle problems such as poverty, unemployment, or inflation. Then secondly, we need to avoid the separation between economics and other social sciences, something that another authors talked about some days ago, last week, for example, in the Association for Heterodox Economics. Bartlett has highlighted the need to incorporate aspects such as gender, race, or class into economic teaching, something that, of course, neoclassical approach does not. And the third dimension is a proposal based on the concept of decoloniality of power and knowledge. In Latin America, this category is based on an epistemic, theoretical, and methodological approach, which has been designed to understand social relations, and of course, economic relations included, And this point of view represents a challenge to the coloniality of knowledge, a set of methods and categories that ignore and subalternize other epistemic approaches or visions of the world. The proposal presents and suggests that we need to present different schools of thought, different epistemologies, and different methodologies with diversity among subjects and authors, and we should include multiple social categories. This is expected to motivate critical thinking and can be understood as a call of reflection, debate, and respect of ideas, and challenge to common sense and promotion of self-thinking. Well, so the three-dimensional approach then is based on these three things: pluralism, decoloniality, socioeconomics, and decoloniality, and wants to promote critical thinking. And also, in terms of methodology, is based on Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian thinker, and he talked about the dialogic education, which is part of the education of liberation. Paulo Freire discussed banking education against education for freedom, and there the banking education presents that knowledge is considered as a donation of those who judge themselves wise to those who are judged ignorant. And instead of that, dialogic education, or education for freedom, proposes a reconciliation of teacher and students in order to become both teacher and students, simultaneously educators and learners. That means in dialogic education, the teacher also learns from the students. And this is something that we're going to use in our class. So the experience is based on like almost 400 student surveys in the last 5 years in secondary school and university level in the National University of La Plata in Argentina. And the results that I am going to present show a high valuation of students, about 90% of satisfaction between students and teacher too. So what are the findings? And this will be the end. The main findings of this study, of this approach, is that, first of all, it is fundamental to begin by serving students' interests. That is exactly what dialogic education means. The first thing when we start our course is to ask students what do they want to learn, what do they want to discuss, what is the debate going to be, and then reconstruct or rebuild our curricula, our program, in order to tackle these questions. Second, it is better to resort to original authors than textbooks, because textbooks in general do not include conflict and power, and do not include the discussions among authors. And in general, classical authors used to discuss a lot. Third, diversity in terms of gender becomes important, and diversity in terms of race and nationality is necessary in non-European or North American countries. Congress like the one we are participating right now, or YSI-INET, show me that there are people working on these subjects. For example, dependency theory. In the last years, I have seen that they published a book on dependency, and I got to know that there are people working on dependency theory in Asia or Africa, which I didn't know, and this is part of the coloniality of knowledge and power. I mean, we do not get in touch between Latin Americans, Africans, and Asians, or Caribbean people, and that is exactly the problem we are pointing out right now. And as Rama Saladien has just said, there is a group of decolonizing study group that is working on right now, and I didn't know, and that is an example of this. Fourth, program debates stimulate interest and alternative ways of thinking. This is exactly going against chat and talk methodology. We should incorporate more debates in the classroom. 5, socioeconomics approach should be part of each debate, and social issues should not be separated from economic issues, taking into account that economics is a social science. 6, each student must be given a chance to produce knowledge in order to stimulate her or his capacity for original thinking. Something very that students like very much is to create and give their own opinion about economic matters. 7, interviews and visits show that economic analysis is not circumscribed to academics. This is very well known when we invite a visitor who can give his experience, shows that economic teaching should incorporate this. And we have for example, in La Plata, we have agricultural producers, and when we invite them, we can see the problems of generating the price, the construction of the price, and for example, inflation in Argentina, which is a very big problem. 8, movies are an excellent resource to address issues such as finance, crisis, labor market, etc. But not only movies, also songs, for example, as Clandestino from Manu Chao, who's talking about immigration, that could start discussions with students, and that is also very well accepted for students, and they can give their own examples and proposals on these subjects. And finally, always pluralism in terms of giving different approaches, different alternatives, and not just one correct answer. Is a matter of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leandro, for your presentation. Now we have around 35 minutes for Q&A, for comments. So if you want to make a question, you can write it on the chat or the Q&A box. And if you want to express orally, just raise your hand. That you can do you can just raise your hand, and I'll allow you to speak. We'll start with a few questions that have already been answered by Mehdi, and Barkin has answered that. Barkin, do you want to make a comment on that first, just to start and leave people some time to think what they want to ask or what they want to comment?
Yeah, so I could read the question that was asked by Mehdi, and then, I could also give you like the answer that I typed on there, just so that everyone could get to hear it as well. So Mehdi's first question was about the socialization of investment, and the specific paper he points out is one of the papers I used in my writing as well. So I say, our points, again, like, we're essentially making the same, like, I'm making essentially the same points as Mehdi, but like trying to clarify, because you could always just stretch it to different ways. So for me, my answer was the socialization of investment. It could be interpreted as the government pioneered, aka like the modern, people who are familiar with MMT, job guarantee type, or again, as I mentioned, as Minsky calls, like New Deal like investments. But again, a lot of the times one of the biggest misconceptions that is put forward by the neoclassical synthesis or monetarist theories even is to like consider the government as a competitor of the private sector in the labor market. And what we're saying is that government is not a competitor in the employment market. It's a complementary economic agent, which could employ anyone and raise their skill and education level. And by the time, they withdraw their hand from the market, they'll be ready to be employed by the private sector. So it's a complementation. So, and, you know, the socialization of investment also, it could be done in more prudent ways. And, you know, as Minsky pointed out, as people's capitalism, in which the people owned stocks in the corporation. So it was the household ownership of the stocks and corporations. In response, you know, Mehdi is curious about, you know, what Minsky is meant to say about the New Deal. And, you know, he says he thinks that Minsky means to radicalize New Deal and not to reduce it to a conjunctural job guarantee scheme. And that's why he calls for the socialization of investment, exactly because state is not a complementary agent, but the agent that defines the job market. Did I miss something? So again, there are elements of both, Mehdi, and I mentioned that in my answer as well. Like the modern interpretations of the Minsky job proposals, and, you know, I included them in the presentation as well, like, are interpreted by Minsky's own students, and, you know, they are the ones who are teaching me at the Levy Institute, and, you know, that's how Rendell Wray and Pavlina Cherneva and all those other MMT people arrived at the job guarantee program, like through reading Minsky, or rereading Minsky in a way. And also, you know, they had the chance to work with the Minsky directly. So, you know, that's like that complementary agent part, like it doesn't come from me, but it comes from the people that work with Minsky. Second part, yes, I agree with that. Government is also the referee in the game, and that's like that's the metaphor that I'd like to put forward, that, you know, again, government is there to, like, you know, set the rules and the regulations of the game, but you cannot omit the fact that government is also a player in the game. So that's where it comes from, you know, like, as I mentioned, like the government like has a buffer stock mechanism for almost everything, you know, when it's the recessionary times, you know, like they buy excess corn, you know, just to keep the price level stable. But labor, and that's what the job guarantee program attempts at, you know, like creating a buffer stock mechanism for labor, which is also a commodity if you think about it in a different way. Yeah, and I think there's another question for Leandro.
Yes, I'll read it right away. A question from Michelle. Again, if any of you wants to express your opinions, comments, or questions orally, then just raise your hand or let me know in the chat, and I'll allow you to do it. I read these questions that we have so far. These are 3 questions for Leandro. The first one is from Michelle. Leandro, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation, powerful presentation. In my own experience here in South Africa, this side of teaching is often met with a lot of animosity from the more mainstream and well-established economists. Do you have any advice for how to approach these academics? Secondly, I'd really be interested to hear your opinion on how time-consuming this type of teaching can be. This means that there is often less time that can be devoted to research. How do you think we can attempt to push back on the publish or perish narrative? I think that's enough for now. Then we'll have two more questions. Then we can get into after you answer this.
Okay, thank you very much to Michelle. First of all, okay, do you have any advice for how to approach these academics? Well, I would say that we should get in touch. We should get in touch between different researchers here in Latin America, especially because we have first very important capacity is that we all talk Spanish or Portuguese, so we can. I mean, I use readings in Portuguese in my class too, so we could share investigations and research, and I think we should do more practice of discussing what are we doing in heterodox economic teaching. So we should get in touch between different researchers, and then what time comes? Okay, and what time consuming? Yes. Well, that is a problem, of course. What can we do about time? We don't have much more time to discuss some things on class. So in general, my position would be of giving the opportunity to get to know different approaches in the class and then develop those approaches outside the class. And especially this is important when we're talking about research. If you give the possibility of research for students, they always have the chance to get to know more authors, more contributions, and go deeply in this situation. So first thing would be letting the possibility to know different authors and then giving the possibility to develop them outside the classroom. This is what was the most stimulating, because in these years and right now, for example, they are talking about COVID-19 in Latin America, and I am learning a lot about that. Last year, they made research about digital capitalism, something that was presented yesterday, for example, in the panel of the AHE conference about formation of value, etc. in these days, and the platform capitalism. So I think we could learn a lot by doing that, by giving just the chance to get to know different authors and go deeply there outside the classroom.
Okay. I think we have two more questions for Leandro so far. The first one is by Antonella. Can you speak a little more about your finding number 4? Great presentation, thank you. And from Sergio, Leandro, great presentation, quite interesting and stimulating issue. Where can we find this paper or slides with the references? Thanks.
Okay. Okay, yes, I was watching which was the 4, my finding number 4. Finding number 4 is about practice experiences or teaching experiences or pedagogical experiences in the class. And well, after every class, and I developed this in the paper. I don't know if it's going to be published, but that's a question for Nicholas. But we have done, what I have done is to generate surveys every year from the students, and then get an evaluation between students and teacher. And what is this finding? That debates among students and teachers, and when visitors came to the class, are very important to stimulate new possibilities and give alternatives way of thinking. And we have done this with visitors that came. For example, I was talking about IT and revolution. Once we invited someone who was in IT during the Twister in 2010, and we were discussing exactly this: what happened in IT, what happened with the revolution in IT, and the students, when they get to know that experience, they get committed with the subject. For example, role playing is another finding. When students, for example, take one side they do not agree, they can get to know those positions. And for example, they have to defend neoclassical thinking or Marx thinking. And when they do that, they get committed to with those possibilities. There are another examples in the paper. If you want, I can share it. And Sergio was wondering, where can we find this paper? Okay. Okay, this paper can be found. That is a question for Nicholas. I don't know if AHE is going to publish these papers, and but if not, I can share with anyone who wants.
Thanks, Leandro, for your answers. Actually, that's a question for Ingrid, not for me. I don't know if she's still here. I have a question myself for Barkin. which kind of deals with the way we can use this Minskian approach in order to understand the instability in underdeveloped countries or southern countries, or the name we want to give it, because you focused on something that's not so usual. That's the heterogeneity within the countries. That's something that's sometimes are usually forgotten when people analyze the Minskian instability approach. That's something that you have told the way the way low income and high income sectors relate to each other in developed countries is something that's completely different from the way it is in underdeveloped countries, where sometimes this heterogeneity is much tougher. We could say the connections between those sectors are not so fluid. It's not so clear. So I wanted to ask you if you've thought of the applicability, or maybe the limitations of the Minskian theory when you want to use it to explain the instability or the paths or of not developed, of underdeveloped or undeveloped countries.
Thank you, Nicholas, for your question. Actually, there is an unofficial, I would say, like a branch of like MMT, and I myself would place myself on that branch. I had the fortunate opportunity to work with Rendell Wray directly myself. So MMT for developing countries, and my dissertation topic was MMT, like application of MMT, which takes its roots from financial instability hypothesis on the applicability on Cyprus. And the problem with the financial instability hypothesis I mentioned, I don't see it as a problem, to be honest with you, but yes, Minsky looked at the evolution of like finance and the system in the United States and wrote all these things. But when we look at it from a different perspective, we could find, yes, the financial system is not as sophisticated and developed in like developing countries, or I make the dichotomy of sovereign and non-sovereign nations, financially non-sovereign nations. But in another way, if you look at it, the financial system in the United States is very intertwined with the rest of the world. So if you look at the problems that the developing countries or financially non-sovereign countries are facing, they, again, when we try to address the root cause of the problem with them is also the problem of full employment. And the reason why they cannot attain the tight full employment is because they don't have financial sovereignty, and then you have like a very superficial problems that are listed, exchange rate volatility, institutional problems, corruption, all these other problems that we see, and then we say, okay, these are the problems that the underdeveloped countries face, or like developing countries face. But again, when we try to attack the root cause of the problem, we see that they face this because they are not financially sovereign. So again, it ties back to the financial instability hypothesis and its implications that were interpreted by Minsky's own students. So I say there are connections. I wouldn't say direct applicability, but connections.
Great, thanks a lot. Does anyone want to make any question? Yes, Mehdi wants to make a question. I'm allowing you to talk. So now you're on.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Leandro, and also Barkan, because of your very interesting presentation. I speak from Bergamo, Italy, which until a few years ago, it used to have the name of the great economist Hyman Minsky, the faculty, because Minsky has taught in Bergamo, and also Rendell Wray every year comes here to lecture about. I actually enthusiastically bought the book by Cherneva, the one published A Job Guarantee, the case for a job guarantee.
Yes.
So keep in touch, because you really struck the chord actually, what struck me about that paper of 66, but also other papers till like about 96, when the last paper by Minsky about the full employment or tight full employment is published, is that it seems like a mechanical scheme. Like there is a conjunctural part, but there's also a radical part. I think he meant that the financial instability hypothesis is meant to actually be countered, or the investment boom, if you like, the collapse of an investment boom, because an investment boom makes it even more destabilizing in a financially sophisticated economy.
That's what we talked about, right?
Yes, exactly. But I wanted also to address our panel's problem with saying, well, many of the financially sophisticated economies are actually developing or emerging economies, like Malaysia, for example, or Dubai, for instance. These are economies who have suffered greatly from the financial instability, both in Malaysia and both have encountered in different phases the investment boom. If you remember, like 1998 crisis of Malaysia, but also countries which are now practically developed countries like South Korea. They have been through it, and they go periodically through. So this is, I think, a global issue, because most of the countries, including Argentina, for example, have a sort of a sophisticated financial sector, which affects greatly the investment sector, but also the job. Just wanted to finish this last point about the Cherneva book. I think after I read the book, I thought that the mechanical scheme of Minsky maybe is very specific to the US, which you have a very, very big unskilled labor part and a small skilled industrial labors.
Right.
But when you come to economies when you have, like for Italy, like Germany, you have a very big skilled labor market, then the mechanical scheme has to be changed, and industrial policy has to, especially in these times, because now everybody's talking about industrial policy in Europe, because Europe is in great big trouble now, and not only like Southern Europe, but the whole Europe as such. So I think this has to be addressed in a non-mechanical way. Maybe there's a reason to develop the non-mechanical part of the Minsky's argument, and going exactly to the specifics as he always did. So that was only a comment. Hope I didn't.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, of course. Thank you for your comment. Thank you for your input. You know, I am on the same page with you, and you know, the only thing I would add to it is that you know, like we need to keep in mind the context of the paper that was, you know, that put out all these proposals and all the mechanics of the labor market and everything beyond it. So you know, like 60s, and you know, just like everyone else, Minsky is making very simplistic assumptions and, you know, categorizing, making dichotomies. So I am pretty sure like he had more, like he knew, like, you know, and he lived through the evolution of the system, and you know how like sophisticated the labor market also got, you know, as we went forward. So yeah.
Great. We have two questions on the box for Barkin. The first one is by Zachary. How could we relate monetary sovereignty to dependency theory? And Robin is asking, critics of Minsky ask why financial agents do not recognize the problem and adapt their behavior to avoid crisis. Do you have any explanation for the recurrence of overconfident investment behavior?
So the first question, I am not familiar with the dependency theory, but I would assume, I'm gonna make an assumption here that, you know, like to like give an answer. So so in, you know, I make the dichotomy of like monetarily sovereign countries and monetarily non-sovereign countries. And if you are a monetarily non-sovereign country, aka like developing country in the development literature, you face a dependency on developed countries. And if this is what you're asking, unless you attain a level of monetary sovereignty, yes, you'll be dependent on the rest of the world. And the second question?
Yeah, the second question, I can read again. It's Krzysztof Minsky asked why financial agents do not recognize the problem and adapt their behavior to avoid crisis. Do you have any explanation for the recurrence of overconfident investment behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to this was given by, not only by Minsky, but long time ago by Mr. Keynes himself. The animal spirits are the guide, they provide the guidance for the investment behavior. And so, and Minsky relies on that too. And, as we see, Minsky makes the claim that also, which I agree personally, that, a capitalist system has an innate instability problem, and there's always an optimism. And, as I mentioned in the presentation, the more optimism you have about your investment means that your past debts are validated. And, when you have a success, like when you have a history of success with your investment, then you're willing to take more risks because you're saying that, oh, I invested and it worked, so I'm going to take more risks and more risks. So like that optimism drives your willingness to take more risks, and make you more elastic to risky behavior. So yeah, I think it just, as we mentioned, and as Mehdi put forward too, that it's an innate instability problem that could only be solved by attacking the root cause of the problem.
Thanks a lot. We have a message from Antonella again. I recommend Bonizzi, Kaltenbrunner, Karbowski, and Seira for an interesting survey about financialization in developing or emerging countries, and journal books of Professor Costas Lapavitsas. Thanks, Antonella, for the suggestion.
Thank you for your input.
Do we have any other comments or questions from the audience? Does anybody want to say whatever they want? Anything? We have 10 more minutes. If there's no one, I would like to ask Leandro. You made an input on using movies as a way to complement the teaching. Which movies do you suggest could be useful if any else are teaching economics and they find some interesting movies to share?
Okay, that is your question, Nicolas. Well, in the Critical Economic Society in Argentina and Uruguay, we have presented some works on movies last year or previous years. Well, in order to tackle the financing problem, you use The Big Short or The Wolf of Wall Street. Those are Eurocentric or North American movies. But in Argentina or Latin America, we have also a lot of movies that would be interesting. I don't know if anybody's going to know, but for example, Nine Queens is a movie that talks about financialization of labor market, also a little bit in Argentina, and neoliberalism. We use Life and Debt, which is a movie from Jamaica, and it is a good movie to talk about external debt. For example, now in Argentina is now renegotiating its external debt. Eric Bromwich is a movie about labor market too, that it's interesting. Bread and Roses, it's a Glenn Loach movie which is very important to talk about feminist economics and also care situations, work care. Well, there are a lot of movies in the contribution. There are mentioned some, but there are works, there are papers that talk about that too, and I cited them in the bibliography of the paper.
Thank you very much for your answer. We have Mehdi recommending The Inside Job as well as a movie that can be used.
Yes.
Any other questions, comments from the audience? I give you a little time. In the meantime, I'll just make some advertising of our next YSI webinar, which will take place on July the 29th at 2 p.m. British time. Do your calculations for your home time. It's heterodox approaches of finance, and we have actually Barkin's presentation was we thought of putting it there, but eventually the schedule made us add it here. But we'll have Francisco Perez from UMass in the US, Liberating African Money, Joseph Chung-Yang, Poemi's Contribution to Monetary Theory, Ricardo Zolea from the Roma Trade University, the relationship between profit rate and interest rate, the role of bank profitability, and Upsteer and Okulkit from Sunny Purchase College in the US, Inequality and the Capital Controversy, a Cambridge view of technological progress in Piketty and Marx. That's going to take place on our YSI webinar on July 29th, so everybody is welcome to join. And 2 days later, we have the YSI plenary, which will be which is also part of this AHE schedule. In case there are no other questions, on behalf of the organization team, I'd really like to thank Barkin and Leandro for joining, and everyone else for attending and for joining the session. And I hope you'll keep joining the different sessions that will take place all through this month. And we hope that on-site events will be able will be allowed soon, so that we can start seeing each other once again in person. Far, thank you very much, everyone. We have chat. So thank you. Thank you very much, Leandro, Barkin. If you want to say some final words, it's your call to.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having us, and thank you for listening and for the constructive input, and for everything. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, the organizers and the people attending. Thank you for the questions too.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.